got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keene making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keene, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keene, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. We are marching towards Christmas, a time of good cheer and generosity, often represented, I think, best of all by Hollywood. We think of movies in the 1940s like It's a Wonderful Life and Meet Me in St. Louis, in which cities were always represented as generous places, snowy places, places that we want to live. You could think of movies in the 1960s even, The Apartment, a wonderful film about Christmas in New York City, even up to 1989 when Harry Met Sally. New York was presented as a good place to live, and up to 2003 with the movie Elf. New York again appeared very attractive, though I wonder what movies about 2025 in New York City would be like. A city now of increasing homelessness, or perhaps what we might call placelessness. That at least is the term that my guest today uses. Placeless, homelessness in the new Gilded Age, by Patrick Markee, who's dedicated his life in many ways to homeless advocacy. Patrick's new book, Placeless, is just out. Patrick, I don't want to turn this into a movie show, but does it come to mind that I don't quite know how Hollywood would represent big American cities like New York City, or where I am in San Francisco, you're in New York, or Los Angeles, which are increasingly dominated, at least the streets, by homeless people?
Well, sadly, I think kind of true to Hollywood tradition in many ways, the less romantic tradition, I think they would just ignore it or sort of hide it, and that seems to be the truth. I mean, the few times that Hollywood has ever dealt with the stories of homeless people or actually tried to grapple with homelessness, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. But we could probably do a whole conversation about the mixed record of Hollywood depictions of homelessness. But as you said, the reality now is that we have a historic homelessness crisis here in New York City, where I am now, and across the United States. More than 100,000 people are sleeping in New York City homeless shelters each night now, including 35,000 children. And that doesn't count the thousands more who are sleeping out in the streets or in the subway system or in the parks or in other unsheltered public spaces. So we're looking at the worst homelessness crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and it's a crisis that's just getting worse.
Yeah, not to be celebrated in these Christmas times. I know that New York City is describing it as we speak. It's very cold in New York, as code blue for these 100,000 people. Are these all people on the street? We've done shows in the past, Patrick, where the term homeless or placeless is often politicized. Would it include people who are sleeping on other people's couches, or are these people who are literally on the street?
No, I'm glad you asked that question, because that figure, that 100,000 people a night who are homeless, is our nightly shelter population. So that's folks that are in shelters. And as I said, that's made up of about 2/3 of those 100,000 folks in our shelter system are in families. 35,000 of them, in fact, are children, which is just a shocking kind of statistic. And then, as I said, we've got a few thousand more who are unsheltered on the streets. But that does not include what I call in the book the hidden homeless population, which is the folks who are living sort of doubled up or in severely overcrowded housing. And that might be as many as 250,000 New Yorkers at any given time. When you look at the national figures, the numbers are even more startling. We probably have close to 800,000 people who are homeless on any given night, just in terms of literal homelessness, so in shelters or on the streets. But in reality, we've got probably 3.5 million hidden homeless folks who are living in doubled up or overcrowded housing, to the extent now where the research and the data show that across the United States, about 1 of every 50 Americans is experiencing homelessness at some point over the course of the year.
Not a lot of fun. I'm guessing the vast majority of people watching and listening to our show, Patrick, are not homeless. What is the point of your book? We've done a number of books over the years on homelessness by advocates like yourself. Some people have even experienced it. So what are you arguing in Placeless, Homelessness in the New Gilded Age, that hasn't been said before?
Well, I wanted to try and get at what are really the root causes, the structural causes of modern mass homelessness. I mean, as I said earlier, the homelessness crisis that we're experiencing now and that really began in the late 1970s in New York and then in the early 1980s up to the present in other American cities is the longest sustained period of mass homelessness. The last such period that we had was during the Great Depression of the 1930s, which, if anything, was even more severe on a kind of night-to-night basis.
And we had what were they called? Hoovervilles? That was the description of people who were essentially homeless in those times.
Yeah, the Hoovervilles and sort of shanty towns that, popped up in, cities across the country. Here in New York in Central Park, we had people who were just living in kind of makeshift shacks in Central Park or along the various riverfronts. But that period, as bad as homelessness was in those days, it was of much shorter duration. And then we had a period of history, which I think has been forgotten largely in the United States, really from World War II until the 1970s, where we had remarkably little homelessness. It's not like there was zero homelessness, but it was really, concentrated among, typically middle-aged or older men in, Skid Row districts or sort of, like the Bowery in New York City or Central Harlem. Just some places where you saw, some people sleeping out in the streets, but throughout the rest of the city, you didn't see it. And most of all, we didn't have the just uncalculable number of homeless families and children that we've had in the last 40, 50 years. And that's what the book, I think, tries to really examine in a historical way, is looking at what were those structural causes of this modern crisis and what's causing it to persist and to sustain. And really, we've got, maybe I would say 3 major causes. One, structural economic changes that we saw in this country and, in other advanced economies as well, coming out of the 70s into the 80s, or loss of manufacturing jobs, loss of industry, just more precarious service sector jobs, which paid much less. At the same time, housing costs rising at a remarkable rate. And that had a lot to do with neoliberal and right-wing policies that were adopted coming out of the Reagan era and have really continued largely since the 1980s under Reagan. Cutbacks in federal housing programs, changes in the way the government, used to provide assistance to low-income and working class people who couldn't afford housing, now almost, not doing that nearly at all. And then finally, other causes like systemic racism, which is one of the reasons that, in New York City, 90% of our homeless population is Black or Latino, while they make up maybe only half of the actual population of the city. So those communities are just, disproportionately affected by homelessness due to the legacy of systemic racism and, certain kind of racist and right-wing policies that have been adopted by our political leaders over the last few decades.
What's your own history, Patrick? How did you become this lifelong advocate?
Well, I'll tell you, one part of the answer is that I grew up in, as we were discussing offline earlier, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, a sort of an industrial city that had fallen on hard times.
And it's back on hard times.
Yeah, absolutely.
One headline I found for this conversation, thousands of Ohioans now could face homelessness at least because of federal policy change. There's already a significant proportion of people in Cleveland who are homeless.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd be happy to talk about some of those terrible changes that the Trump administration is putting forward. But when I was growing up in the 1970s in Cleveland, even though Cleveland was going through some economic hardships, the city itself actually almost went bankrupt. You didn't actually see homelessness. You didn't see people sleeping out on the sidewalks and the streets. I went to high school right in the, in the center of the city, and, you just did not see that. And that was typical in other American cities of that period. It was when I went to college, and actually in Boston, Massachusetts in the early 1980s, that I first started to see people sleeping out on the sidewalks. And it was just shocking to see. And, only people who are, maybe my age or older can actually remember that was a shocking kind of experience to actually see mass homelessness on that scale in the early 1980s. It was.
Well, no, I have to say, I lived in Boston or Cambridge at that time too. And maybe I'm not as observant as you, but I don't remember, at least quoting your term, mass homelessness in Boston and Cambridge in the early 80s, but maybe I just didn't see it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I was in Cambridge as well, and I will say, we used to see, my college roommate, who is actually from Europe, from Switzerland. He and I befriended a homeless guy named Daniel, who was sleeping right near the Harvard Square subway station, sort of metro station there. Got to know him, invited him to sleep in our dormitory room when the nights got really cold. And he used to tell us about the various shelters that he would go to. And sometimes they'd just be full up for the night on the coldest night.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point was that our perception of people who aren't homeless, who walk around cities, back in the 80s, I'm guessing that a few homeless people would have seemed like an epidemic. These days, we've become so, I don't know, not you, but most of us, I think, have become so inured, so, I don't know what it maybe insensitized by whole encampments of homeless people that a handful doesn't seem like mass homelessness anymore.
Well, I mean, I think what you're getting at, and I write about this in the book, is that it's become homelessness, mass homelessness has become almost an accepted common.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Exactly.
American life. Yeah, I mean, right now, probably 2/3 of Americans are too young to remember a day when there wasn't that kind of mass homelessness, when it wasn't a sort of an expected reality that you would see people just splayed out on a sidewalk or sleeping in transportation terminals, or that we wouldn't have these, tens of thousands of, children and families who are homeless each night. That just, wasn't the reality only a few decades ago. And for many people, I have a son who's a teenager, and, he's grown up in New York where that's just the norm, right? To see homelessness. And I think it does something to us as a society and as a people. As you said, we become kind of inured, almost a little bit kind of numb to it. And that itself is, I think, something that we need to be.
Yeah. And I mean, people often look back in history, obviously slavery, terrible events in the past, and think, how could those people have lived through that? How could they have accepted it? How could they have gone about doing their daily work? I'm guessing that perhaps in the future, hopefully in the future, people will think back on us and think, how could they have walked around New York or San Francisco and accepted the fact that hundreds of thousands of people were sleeping on the street?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I do think, I think what it gets to, and I think you're alluding to this, and this is a key argument in the book, it's a policy choice. The fact that we have mass homelessness is really, the result of certain policy decisions that have been made and continue to be made, and that can be undone. The solutions to this problem are fairly straightforward and have been known for a very long period of time. Unfortunately, there are right-wing and conservative politicians in this country that have, blocked any effort to put in place those proven solutions. And unfortunately, under Donald Trump right now and under his allies, we're living through another of these periods of time where there's attempts to undo the little work that has been done to address the problem of homelessness.
Is that, and I'm sure you're going to say that I'm wrong, but is it too convenient for progressives to blame everything on Trump or on neoliberalism? You mentioned the Bowery earlier, which was once a place of great poverty in New York. I was in the city a few weeks ago and had a lovely dinner in the Bowery. It's very, very expensive. It's part of what you would call this new Gilded Age, for better or worse. Don't we all, everyone who's participating in this new global age, and many progressives in San Francisco and New York City are actually doing rather well out of the prosperity for some, at least. Shouldn't everyone share the blame? Is it too convenient to just blame everything on some neoliberal demon, or Trump, of course, who gets blamed for everything?
Well, I don't know if it's convenient or not. It is true that right-wing policies and right-wing politicians, not all of them Republican, although most of them Republican, although some Democrats as well, have been to blame for some of the, the policies that have contributed to mass homelessness and continue to sustain it. I mean, specifically under Reagan, the federal housing budget was cut by 80% under Ronald Reagan during his 8 years in office. And it's barely recovered since then. Right now, only 1 in 5 eligible low-income households in the United States that actually qualify for federal housing aid is actually getting it. And that number has actually gone down from 1 in 4 families in the previous decade. So we're seeing sustained cutbacks to the few kind of safety net housing programs that were there to help out. But to your larger question, part of what I argue in the book in the later chapters especially is that homelessness is really only the most kind of visible and obvious example of wider forms of displacement that have happened in our economy and in our society, displacement from jobs and from, kind of certain economic sectors like deindustrialization, and then displacement in neighborhoods like gentrification. So the Bowery is a perfect example.
Yeah,
right?
Classic gentrified neighborhood.
Exactly. The Bowery, I live just, a few blocks away from the Bowery. And, I've had the same experience as you. I used to work at a homeless shelter on the Bowery back in the 1990s and the early 2000s. That was right above the old CBGB punk rock club, right? The sort of famous place.
Yeah, I know it.
The Ramones and Talking Heads and Blondie used to play. Right above it was a shelter for homeless men that had been previously sort of a lodging house, a rooming house for poor single men who had nowhere else to go and would sleep in these kind of small cubicles. That kind of like cheap housing has been lost to, conversion into higher rent luxury housing or conversion into condos. And that neighborhood has itself become gentrified. And it's only one of many neighborhoods that I write about in the book. I talk about Bedford-Stuyvesant in the heart of Brooklyn, used to be the sort of the central neighborhood of the largest Black community in central Brooklyn, and one of the largest Black communities in the United States. It's been incredibly gentrified over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I was just there as well. And I'm particularly interested in Bed-Stuy because that was the neighborhood that Bobby Kennedy, when he was a senator from New York, really focused on. Have we had the same phenomenon in Bed-Stuy as in Bowery? On the one hand, you have these very, very expensive townhouses and excellent restaurants and clothes stores and all the rest of it. And on the other hand, you've got people sleeping on the street. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, you've had a situation where the townhouses and brownstones there were kind of catnip to certain kinds of, real estate interests, and then certain kinds of well-to-do, mostly white, homeowners who want to come in and sort of buy these properties. And as you said, all the things that usually come with gentrification, the fancy wine shops and cafes and boutiques and restaurants have come in there. But Bedford-Stuyvesant used to be a neighborhood that was more than 90% Black. Now it's only about 50% Black. And it's the home to, 2 of the largest homeless shelters in New York City. There's a giant armory on Sumner Avenue in the heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant, which still shelters, 200 homeless men each night. And more than that, we've seen long-term tenants of that community, some of the people that actually built that neighborhood back up from, some of the darker days of the 80s, the 70s and 80s. Those long-term tenants have been displaced by gentrification as housing costs have risen and they can no longer afford to live in the neighborhood that they helped to build.
Patrick, coming back to politics, you noted Reagan. I'm the last person to defend him or Trump for that matter, but I'm curious. We talked about Bed-Stuy, which is dominated by Democratic politicians from Bobby Kennedy backwards and forwards. We've had 16 years of Democratic presidents since Reagan, Clinton and Obama. Homelessness has never become, certainly on the national level, never became a major political issue. Did it scare? I mean, Clinton, of course, is notoriously centrist. Obama, slightly less so. the economics of this aren't that dramatic, are they? I mean, why, as this problem emerged in a post-Reagan America, why has mostly, certainly on a national level, federal level, why have politicians avoided the subject, which is so troubling? I mean, no one's going to defend homelessness, but as you say, it's one of those family secrets that we all know and conveniently don't discuss and look the other way.
Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, I think part of it is that homelessness is often kind of portrayed as a local only issue, and so you end up with kind of, cities and, municipal governments end up being the ones that kind of end up taking the blame for the problem of homelessness, even when one of the major causes is a lack of federal resources to really deal with the long-term solutions to the problem. So again, here in New York City, which isn't the best example because New York City does have more resources than others. We had 20 years of essentially Republican mayors, from Rudy Giuliani through Michael Bloomberg.
That's centrist. I mean, even Rudy
well,
was centrist at the time. Wasn't he?
They like to portray themselves as centrist, but when it comes to policies around poor people, around homelessness, certainly among, kind of, racial issues, they were incredibly right wing. I mean, they were, had, racist policing policies and certainly some very anti-poor and anti-homeless policies, and contributed to dramatic increases in homelessness. When I started working as a homeless advocate in the early 1990s, we had 20, little more than 20,000 people a night in our shelter system each night. By the time Michael Bloomberg left office, 20 something years later, we had almost 60,000 people a night in our shelter system. And under Bloomberg, the supposed amazing manager, the numbers of homeless families in our city grew by about 80%. So we saw the kind of like disastrous policies of that period. And then to jump forward to the, where we are right now, we're now seeing Donald Trump taking a page from exactly the kind of broken and failed and punitive policies that were played out in New York in the 90s and in the aughts, and trying to enact exactly those same kinds of policies. And I'll just speak about two of them in particular.
Yeah, I want to get to Trump in a minute, but coming back to the political issue, I'm talking to you from San Francisco. I'm sure you're familiar with the book San Francisco. Is highly politicized debate about whether or not there's a connection between the homelessness crisis in San Francisco, which has always been, seems to be worse than anywhere else, or certainly comparable to Los Angeles and New York, and the fact that the city has been managed for years, ever since I've been here, certainly by increasingly liberal politicians. What do you make of the arguments of books like San Francisco that blame, in part at least, the crisis of homelessness on permissive local governments? Well,
I will say I haven't read that book.
But you're familiar with the argument.
I'm familiar with the argument. I think the argument is kind of a distortion and a distraction. I mean, look, one doesn't have to be a Republican to have embraced some kind of neoliberal policies or to be part of essentially a political coalition that we saw emerging in American cities coming out of the 1970s and into the 1980s that really gives most of the political power to real estate and finance. And those are kind of the core, it used to be in the post-war period, in those decades coming after the Great Depression and World War II, industrial capital, was a part of that political coalition, and also labor unions. And so you had a period of time where, city governments wanted to make sure that the working class and low-income folks had housing, had places to live, because that was part of the kind of political calculus that you needed to protect. Now it's really about profiting from, from development of housing, from the ownership of housing, as much extraction from housing as you can get. It's one of the reasons.
Are you saying that, you mentioned real estate and finance, are you suggesting that the bankers, the real estate, that the owners of real estate in towns, cities like San Francisco, New York, maybe Cleveland, Los Angeles and elsewhere, that homelessness somehow reflects their own economic interest, and maybe they would never acknowledge it. Maybe they haven't even thought it, but it benefits them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it contributes to the rising housing costs in those cities in a very definite way. I mean, there's a reason we had in New York City at one point, private equity firms, and still private equity firms, hedge funds were coming in, were some of the largest property owners, some of the largest owners of rental properties here in New York City. At one point in the past decade, almost 10% of our rent regulated units, of our rent stabilized apartment units, were controlled by private equity, were owned by private equity. And that's because they were extracting profits and attempting to raise rents in those properties. So I guess what I'm saying is you have that. And then at the same time, you have kind of, merchant groups and commercial interests, which have an interest in making sure that homelessness is less visible in urban centers. And that's where you get these kind of criminalization campaigns, these police crackdowns on homeless people in parks and in central city neighborhoods. And that's part of the calculus, I think, that's going on now. It's the reason that we haven't seen what's really needed, which are the really substantial investments in deeply affordable housing in our cities, in a way that we would actually have housing that's affordable to the poorest families and the poorest individuals. We haven't seen that kind of investment, certainly not from the federal government, but also not from our local governments like those in San Francisco or here in New York City that can actually afford to make those investments as well.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, if it's true, is profoundly chilling. I'm sure you're familiar with the controversy earlier this year. Mark Benioff, one of the city's largest, one of the city's wealthiest men, the founder, CEO of Salesforce, built Salesforce Tower downtown. A liberal, at least claims to be a liberal, but made a remark earlier this year before one of his big conferences suggesting that Trump should send his National Guard into San Francisco to get the homeless off the streets. Do you think this was an incident? Benioff has since walked the comments back, but do you think this was an example of Benioff and his quote unquote class of multi-billionaires actually telling the truth and then being so shamed that they had to conveniently lie again?
Well, Benioff might have, as you said, quote unquote, walked his comments back, but other sort of wealthy tech executives who are supporters of Trump have been pretty open about how they feel about it. Joe Lonsdale, who's the founder of Palantir, or co-founder of Palantir, is based out of Austin, Texas. I mean, he's funded a right-wing think tank that has been one of the sort of loudest voices in attacking some of the very successful housing programs for homeless individuals. There's a model of housing called Housing First, which has proved to be remarkably successful in addressing homelessness among people living with mental illness and other disabilities. Lonsdale and his right-wing think tank have been on the attack against Housing First programs, and that's resulted now in the Trump administration actually announcing a new policy where they want to withdraw funding for those Housing First programs, which might now threaten the housing of 170,000 formerly homeless individuals who are now living in Housing First programs. He's also called for the wholesale criminalization and sort of police lockdowns or police crackdowns on homeless people, creating camps for homeless people on the outskirts of cities, something that we're actually seeing being created now in the outskirts of Salt Lake City. So, again, I think they're not hiding how they feel about this now. I mean, I think a lot of these billionaires and tech executives are pretty open in the fact that they support a kind of a backwards thinking and very punitive approach to homelessness.
You mentioned neoliberalism. We've done many shows over the last few years, Patrick, on neoliberalism. And many economic historians now argue that we're in the post-neoliberal age. Not quite sure what to define it as, but it's marked by Trump's interest in the state, using the state to invest in companies like Intel. Now, I'm certainly not going to defend Trump, certainly his get tough approach on homelessness, the way in which he's got rid of HUD-VASH. I'm sure you write about that in the book and you have strong opinions. But do you think that Trump's re-embrace of the state in a way might be an opportunity for progressives to rethink homelessness as neoliberalism is rejected by conservatives? Is this a good opportunity for progressives as well to rethink the state? and particularly when it comes to homelessness?
Well, I guess I would answer by saying this. I mean, it's not like the state wasn't playing a role around housing policy during the neoliberal era. It just was a different role. Coming out of the housing movements that we saw during the Great Depression, and then coming out of the New Deal, we saw the state playing a more progressive and positive role in ensuring that we had housing that was affordable to working class and low income people. Public housing, the housing voucher program, which provides rental assistance to low income people, rent controls and rent regulation. All of those things which actually came out of housing movements that, here where I live on the Lower East Side of New York City, and then spread across the country. Those things played a positive role in ensuring that we had a basic stock of affordable housing. And it's one of the reasons we didn't have mass homelessness in the decades after the Great Depression. But beginning under the Reagan era, the state really played a different role through tax policy and tax benefits and other things, started building less and less housing, investing in less and less affordable housing, doing much more to kind of protect the housing interests of real estate and the sort of profit interests of real estate. So I guess what I would say is we need to be going back to the things that we know actually work. I mean, other advanced capitalist countries around the world, in Canada, Western Europe, Japan, they don't have the rates of homelessness that we do. But that's partly because their governments play a role in creating, public housing or what's called social housing outside of the United States, in providing rental assistance to families and individuals that are too poor to afford market rate rents. All of these sort of mixtures of policies that you see in other advanced capitalist countries are working to make sure that you don't have mass homelessness in those countries. So it's it's kind of a proven fact that we can do it. And we did it in this country for a number of decades. We just need to get back to doing that again.
Are there politicians, in your view, who's beginning to talk about it? Mandami, of course, just been elected New York mayor, where you live, has talked about stopping the destruction of homeless encampments. Is he thinking this stuff through? Have you talked to him or his people about it, Patrick?
I haven't talked to him personally. I was definitely a supporter, and I'm optimistic about what we'll see out of his new mayoral administration. He hasn't, detailed yet a plan on what he wants to do on homelessness or on really affordable housing yet. I mean, most of what he's talked about so far is going in the right direction, and certainly is a real, kind of 180-degree turn from the failed policies that we've had under our current mayor, Eric Adams, and who really was, kind of taking a page from the playbook of Giuliani and Bloomberg, which was, more criminalization of homelessness, less affordable housing development, raising rents on rent-regulated apartments year to year. So Mamdani has talked about, freezing rents on those rent-regulated units, which make up half of our rental housing stock. So that's a positive step in terms of stopping the kind of growth of housing costs for working class and low-income folks. But we need to be doing more to take our sort of city dollars that we have and invest them in creating some deeply affordable housing for the poorest families in the city. This was something, ironically, that was done under Ed Koch, who was the first New York City mayor to confront the crisis of modern homelessness back in the 1980s. And the last years of his mayoralty, he had a kind of deathbed conversion moment where he launched an affordable housing plan that created 150,000 affordable housing apartments. 10% of them went to homeless families and individuals. And there were a number of years where we saw our homeless population go down as a result of those key housing investments.
Is he the model? I mean, I know that you wrote a piece a few years ago about how de Blasio, who inherited a homeless crisis, and got blamed for it. Is Koch the model?
Well, I think that housing plan of Koch's, which again came late in his mayoral administration, and I actually have a wonderful anecdote about it in my book, where many years later he met with the co-founder of Coalition for the Homeless, where I worked for many years, a remarkable guy named Bob Hayes, who had sued Ed Koch around the rights of homeless people. And he met with him, and he basically thanked Hayes and the advocates and said, if it wasn't for you, I would never have done this incredible housing plan, which is now kind of a key part of his legacy. we need to be doing more stuff like that. I mean, Koch made a lot of other, mistakes and had a lot of other bad policies when it came to homelessness, but we definitely need to be going in that direction. De Blasio, I think, tried to do that. Actually, the family homelessness declined under de Blasio after his first year in office, when he had kind of inherited the kind of Bloomberg disaster. He did some things. He didn't go far enough. I think many of us in the advocacy world kind of felt that it was.
Can it be done locally? I mean, if Mandami says, okay, this is the one thing I'm going to put my money into, my time, my energy, my political resources, could he address this without, even if Trump was still in power and he showed profound disinterest?
Yes, I mean, this is one of those examples where New York is a little bit, a little sui generis in terms of other American cities. I mean,
although San Francisco presumably could be the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think some, large cities like that have the resources can do it. Look, New York City's annual budget is larger than the state budget of 35 other states, and then we also have New York State's budget, which obviously contributes to the city. So with those kinds of resources, we could actually be making huge reductions in our homeless population just using our local resources, even if the federal government took a step back, which is certainly what's going to be happening.
What's Gavin Newsom's record? He's controversial on this front. Our governor, California, I'm not sure it wants to be the top state for homelessness, but I'm guessing.
Oh, it is.
Los Angeles and San Francisco, you've got more homeless in this state than anywhere else.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, Newsom has been a disaster, especially when it comes to criminalization of homelessness. I mean, after a recent Supreme Court decision by the conservative majority that allowed essentially the criminalization of homelessness in certain Western states and allowed the dismantling of encampments. Newsom was out there in front of the TV cameras, basically like cheering on the demolition of some homeless encampments and some, just tearing down tents that people were sleeping in. I mean, again, what's the common, the common kind of denominator between cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose, and New York City? And it's housing affordability. It's an incredibly large gap between rental housing costs and the incomes of working class and low income folks. And that's where, you're not seeing the leadership from someone like Newsom, who likes to always talk about how California has what would be the fifth largest, economy in the world if it was its own country. He's got the resources to be doing a lot more to invest in the creation of affordable housing. And they need to be doing a lot more of that in California for sure.
Patrick, you've written about being inside the shelters and tunnels of New York's homelessness crisis. There's a science fictional quality to what you describe. It's like watching it coming back to the Hollywood metaphors. It's not A Wonderful Life or Meet Me in St. Louis. It's Blade Runner, isn't it?
Well, the first chapter of the book, I talk about this work that I did alongside my colleagues at Coalition for the Homeless with some homeless people who were sleeping in a train tunnel on the west side of Manhattan that goes under Riverside Park. And at the time in the mid-90s, Amtrak was about to resume passenger train service through that tunnel. It had been closed down for some decades. Used to be a commercial rail line, in fact. And some homeless people beginning in the late 70s through the 80s had started sleeping in the tunnel. And by the time I was, going there to work with them, there were about 30, 40 people still sleeping in this tunnel. Some of them had been living there for years. And we were able to kind of get those folks out of the tunnel and move them directly into housing using some federal housing vouchers, but also using supportive housing, that successful model that I talked about earlier that provides subsidized housing with support services for people living with disabilities like mental illness. And we were able to successfully move them out and get them into stable housing. And at the time, it was considered kind of a radical idea to do something like that. This was around the same days that the Housing First model was being developed, which really proved that you can just take folks off the streets, put them in apartments, provide them with support services, and give them that housing and stability. And it's more successful and cheaper than leaving them homeless in other kinds of institutional care like shelters or hospitals or jails. But at the time, it was considered a radical idea because, as you said, people kind of spoke about the people sleeping in this tunnel as if they were some kind of other species. There was a book with a sort of infamous title called The Mole People, which gained some currency and tried to kind of portray these folks as if they were, some, sort of different type of kind of urban poverty. But what I found in working with them is that these are just people like anybody else. And what they really needed was housing and support. And when you provided them with that, you ended their homelessness, and they lived healthier and, more stable and more settled lives. And that's exactly what I saw when I followed up with them in the years after that. And that's the kind of test case like that. That's essentially like the proof of concept that really was later developed into this housing first model, and then has been proven in research study after research study since then. It works to end homelessness. It maintains their stability. The people who take advantage of housing first programs have better health outcomes than the model that the Trump folks that the Giuliani folks back in the day when I was doing this work wanted to do, which was this model they call treatment first, which is, you first have to go to these therapeutic programs because we think you're too broken and unready for housing. We think you're too dysfunctional or whatever the language might be. None of that is true. These are folks.
What about the role of drugs and mental illness in homelessness? Are you suggesting that those are not really particularly central?
They're not. I mean, I write in the book, I have a whole chapter about this. I never really understood the statement that mental illness causes homelessness. I mean, I've got friends and family living with mental illness. I'm sure you have people in your life too. They're not homeless. I mean, I grew up middle class. So, the folks that were in my life who were struggling with mental illness or are living with mental illness didn't end up falling into homelessness. What caused homelessness, or where the two intersect was that as housing became less and less affordable, and as that sort of stock of housing, which had been kind of the safety net for some of the poorest individuals, including individuals living with mental illness, that single room housing on the Bowery that we were talking about, or you saw similar arrangements in other cities, as that stock of housing became lost, then those folks had nowhere to turn but the streets. The other thing I will say too is the history of deinstitutionalization, has also, and I think, sort of been distorted. It came out of, and this is, obviously a longer conversation, but it came out of a positive impulse that instead of keeping, hundreds of thousands of people in institutional care and state mental hospitals like we did in the 50s and 60s, we could provide care for them in the community in a much better and more effective way with the development of medications and other kinds of treatment. The problem is that when the state and federal governments started cutting down on, started de-investing in those state hospitals and started closing them down, they didn't reinvest the savings into that care, into the community, and most especially, they didn't reinvest those savings into housing.
Yeah, Patrick, what's particularly chilling about your description of all this is that we're on the brink of another major economic dislocation. AI is going to make more and more people unemployed. Just to do a little bit of research for this conversation online, there's already the beginnings of a homeless crisis in Cleveland, in Ohio, in Indiana, all over the country. In your view, how much worse can this become in an age of AI where more and more white-collar people are going to lose their income, where at least if Trump remains in power or J.D. Vance becomes president in 2028, things are only going to get worse and worse? How much worse, firstly, can the situation get? And in political terms, at what point does it become just beyond... I don't know what the word is. I mean, becomes just absurdly troubling that we have the reality of mass homelessness and then the appearance of normalcy in politics and the rest of society.
I mean, that's a big question to answer. I'll start here. I mean, certainly we know the problem will get worse and can get worse under just what Trump himself has talked about doing. So to begin with, as I said earlier, they've talked about taking away funding for housing first programs, for housing programs that have already helped to rehouse 170,000 formerly homeless people. We know that those folks are now at risk of losing their housing. That's already happened and is going to continue to happen. We also know that Trump and his administration have proposed major cutbacks in federal housing programs. One of the things they're talking about doing is putting time limits on some federal housing programs as short as 2 years, a 2-year time limit. Well, we had 2-year time limit programs on some rental assistance programs under the Bloomberg administration here in New York, and all it became was a revolving door back to homelessness for tens of thousands of vulnerable families. So that could contribute to more homelessness. And then I think, just to kind of get at what you're talking about in terms of, in terms of AI or other kinds of dislocation in the economy, during the global economic crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010, when unemployment, rose to double digits for the first time since, I guess, the Reagan recession of the early 80s, we saw like more and more evictions. We saw more and more people losing their homes. We saw more and more people entering our shelter system here in New York or in other cities around the country. I mean, that's clearly a risk as well. I mean, unless we do a lot more to halt the cutbacks in federal housing programs, as inadequately funded as they are now, we're going to start to see the problem of homelessness get even worse. And unless we do much more kind of on the larger sort of economic and justice kind of issues and sort of trying to halt these kinds of structural economic changes you're talking about, we're going to see that problem get worse as well. But there are things that can be done, and I'm hopeful on the local level, whether it's Mamdani here in New York or what's happening in some other cities around the country. I'm hoping that we'll see a model that embraces the sort of proven approaches that actually have reduced homelessness in the past and that can do so again. The causes of this problem are significant and are sort of broad and widespread, but the solutions themselves are actually quite kind of simple and discrete. We just need to be doing them.
Finally, you talked about code blue in New York. It seems the way you're presenting as if it's a code red emergency in the United States. I'm guessing everyone watching or listening to this will think this is just unacceptable. What can we do to help? We've done shows in the past with one, a couple of years ago, indeed, with one homeless advocate in San Francisco who argued that what we could do is just go up every day to a homeless person and treat them as a friend. My sense from what you're saying, I mean, obviously you're not suggesting you shouldn't do that, but my sense from what you're saying, Patrick, is that for ordinary people, for people who are not advocates, who are not in this business like you of living this crisis every day, what we should do is focus on politics, elect local leaders, state level leaders, national leaders who are willing to address the crisis, and that however many smiles we give our local homeless person or bring them some soup, it's not the answer. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say, I think I get asked this question a lot, and I guess my answer would be very much, as you said, I think twofold. I mean, one, get involved in the sort of organizing and advocacy work that's happening in your community around, local elected officials or, races for members of Congress. There are folks that are on the right page and that want to do the right things. They want to fight these cutbacks in federal housing programs, or on the local level that want to build more affordable housing, for the most vulnerable folks. Let's support that, let's support them. There are, in every community, there are advocacy groups and, activist groups that are doing that work. Get involved in that. And then secondly, volunteer your time. It's critically important to help out in the midst of this crisis, whether it's, volunteering at a soup kitchen or a food pantry or at a program that helps homeless kids who are in school, or, a program that's distributing clothing and other kind of needed items to our neediest folks. I mean, that kind of also gives you that personal relationship with the folks that you're serving, which can be so valuable and, makes the problem sort of more real. So yeah, I think those are the two things. There's, every bit is going to help, and every action is going to help.
Well, what else you can do? You can go and get Placeless, buy the book, Homelessness in the New Gilded Age by Patrick Markee. It's something we generally, I think, don't want to read about or think about because it's so unpleasant, but it's one of America's dirtiest secrets. Thank you so much, Patrick. Congratulations on the new book. and keep doing this important new work of reminding us about stuff that we don't want to think about. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the program. I really appreciate it.
Step on the scene.